Okay, I think we've heard the voice from God. Well, welcome everyone. It's great to see so many familiar names popping up on the side of my screen, and I'm really pleased that so many people were interested in participating in this webinar, which I think is just the second that's been offered by the AAMC Professional Development Committee, and it's really meant to be, like all of our activities, designed to sustain a by curators, for curators, peer-to-peer network to share resources, which I think really complements the wonderful skill-building workshops at the annual meetings that I think we all really love. So I said this is our second webinar. The first one last spring was the one on mobile technology and curatorial practice that probably many of you participated in. And we are working on future webinars as well. So I really invite anyone that's interested in being part of the Professional Development Committee to contact me or Jay Clark, who's the chair, or simply come to our session, our working session at the next annual meeting in the spring in Houston. We'd love to have more of you involved. Our goals in creating this particular webinar were, first of all, most clearly just to build the financial literacy of curators. I think this is obviously part of AAMC's brief going back many years now, and I think that we saw this as a way to build that in a very specific way. We want to help curators claim a larger voice in conversations about budgeting, particularly for their own exhibition projects. And it's very interesting seeing the results of the poll growing on screen now, and seeing that it seems about half of people have their own, have full responsibility, half have shared. And I would say I'm probably one of that small percentage, I guess less than 10% now, that has a much less of a role. And I think that's partly why I was particularly passionate about creating, working on this webinar and having a place for those of us who maybe want to really learn a lot more to bring our questions and learn from our peers about this very complex process of building an exhibition budget. This is, of course, a forum where we invite you to ask questions, so please continue to put your questions into the chat bar, and we'll save time at the end of the webinar to address those that haven't been talked about. And of course, we'll also be putting up several instant polls during the course of the webinar to sort of gather and share information in real time. And so if you haven't responded to the one that's on your screen now, please go ahead and do so before it pops away. Our two speakers today were invited to participate because they represent very different institutions, but each of them has a wealth of experience in exhibition budgeting to share with us. Kathleen Morris is the Director of Collections and Exhibitions and the Curator of Decorative Arts at the Sterling and Francine Clark Institute in Williamstown, Massachusetts. And Elizabeth Schlatter is the Deputy Director and Curator of Exhibitions at the University of Richmond Museums in Richmond, Virginia. Their full and very impressive bios are available on the AAMC website. And each of them, as I said, has a great depth of experience to share. And because each of them represents a very different institution, we wanted to be able to talk about exhibitions in a general way that applies to whether you're dealing with a kind of micro budget of only a few $1,000s to a international loan show with a budget of $1 million or more. And we're talking in sort of general principles, drawing on, again, this broad experience so that each of you can take these lessons and apply them to your own projects. We're going to begin with just a quick overview of understanding how budgets work. And of course, each institution is very, very different. But Kathy and Elizabeth will each talk us through how the process works at their institution to kind of lay the groundwork. And then we'll explore how to begin. Actually, I can go ahead to the next, screen here. There we go. This is the agenda for our webinar. Once we talk about how budgets work at an institution, how to figure out how the budget works at your institution, we'll talk about how you go about the process of building a template of costs and revenues that you need to be aware of, whether you're starting with a template that already exists at your institution or you're creating one from scratch. We'll talk about strategies to ballpark costs using historic figures or other readily available resources. And we'll finish up with a Q&A session to bring in the questions that you'll be putting into the chat window throughout the course of the webinar. I think that Sally went over how to type. Everyone sort of tested their ability to type into that chat box. So please just go ahead as a question occurs to you, and I'll make sure that we keep track of those for the Q&A. So with that bit of housekeeping done, let's go on to the first topic on the agenda. Oh, well, first we have actually one more poll has popped up. I'm going to leave that poll up for a moment so people can start to answer that one. As Elizabeth and Kathy talk about the first topic on our agenda, which is understanding how the budget works at your institution, how you go about that, and for each of them to talk a little bit about how the process is set up at their institution. Elizabeth, do you want to start us off?
Actually, Kathy's going to get us started on this.
Oh, Kathy's starting. Okay, my apologies. Kathy, why don't you get us going?
Actually, this is a great poll question to be seeing the results come in as we start to talk about this. And what I'm going to say about how understanding how budgets work at your institution might seem very self-evident and obvious, but I'll run through this quickly, but I think it's just kind of important to keep some of these things in mind as you're thinking about how things work in your own institution. What is included in an exhibition budget can vary greatly from an institution to institution. And for example, some institutions include the cost of marketing and promotion within the overall budget of the exhibition, and some don't. Where I work here at the Clark, we actually have a separate a budget within our communications department that deals with the marketing of any exhibition. So whether their promotional budget is $5,000 or $100,000, it doesn't really affect my managing of the overall exhibition. And likewise, there are other things that sometimes will fall into exhibition budgets and sometimes not, like the catalog. And I mention those two things in particular because they're actually they are potentially very costly items. So just a note to say, as many of you have good or even excellent understandings of how exhibition budgets work at your institution, if you feel like you have fair or insufficient, I'm looking at these categories, then these are questions that maybe you could find someone in the institution to ask. Also important is to know how revenues are applied to exhibition budgets in your institution. And again, this can vary widely from place to place. They're both earned and raised revenues, of course. And it's important to know whether how the exhibition basically gets balanced out. So if in some places there are part of the ticket revenue or all of the ticket revenue for an exhibition might get applied towards funding that exhibition. Grants, obviously, that are raised for exhibitions have to be spent on that exhibition. But I would just say an important thing to ask about how your exhibition budgets work is whether or not that actually becomes what is euphemistically called budget relief. So you have a budget for an exhibition of $100,000, you raise $30,000, but that doesn't mean you can suddenly have $130,000. But sometimes there are ways of budgeting exhibitions where there's a kind of a platform level of the sort of lowest, no bells and whistles, and then you raise money that allow you to add additional things. And that, again, just is very different from one place to another. Another question to ask is how budgets run in your institution for exhibitions, whether they are running on a fiscal year basis or a rolling basis. And I've actually had a lot of experience working both ways. When I was at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, I was managing exhibitions. We were not only on a fiscal year basis, but we also had to follow all the state procurement regulations, which was kind of a headache and a nightmare. And here at the Clark, we're a private institution that decided many years ago to establish what we call a reserve fund to operate our exhibitions out of. So expenses and revenues flow through this fund, and it's on a rolling basis. So an exhibition that's very complicated, where it might take 5 years from the start to the finish to have the whole budget play out. It doesn't have to, there's no benchmark at the end of each fiscal year where a certain balance has to be reached. And that actually makes it much easier. It gives me a lot of flexibility and a lot of maneuverability in how budgets get managed for all of the various exhibitions that might be being developed at the same time. And then finally, important to know how budgets are approved in your institution, when it's done, who does it, when the moments are when there are sort of major budget decisions that affect exhibitions, so that you as the curator of the exhibition can be sure that you're part of that process. I would say in terms of whoever is constructing the budgets for your exhibitions, if it's not you, that it's really important for curators to be sure that those people or that person have as full an understanding as possible of the curatorial vision for the show. So what your goals are in terms of numbers of objects, whether there are loans, how far flung do you envision your loans need to come in order to really do what you need to do curatorially, but then also your ideas about the installation, what will be included, and what needs to be there in order for the show to really work. And I noticed there was a question about interactives. And if that's important to you, if you know that this is an important element of your exhibition, I would just encourage you to make sure that you've created some kind of project précis from the very beginning that outlines all of those things so that it's not a surprise to the people who are beginning to construct the budget. Elizabeth, do you have anything to add, or Heather?
I just was going to jump in because one question that has popped up is not so much content but about terminology. William Rudolph had asked about whether by rolling basis it means the same thing as accrual, and I'm wondering if that if that terminology means anything specifically. Or do you think it's just sort of an institution-to-institution difference of how this terminology is used?
Well, there are different accounting methods. There's the cash method and the accrual method. And when I'm talking about the rolling basis, it doesn't really, and maybe this is probably not an accounting term, it's just the term I'm using. What it basically means for my institution is that it doesn't matter within the life of the project over a number of years when a particular expense happens. So it makes it easier to budget because if you're doing it on a fiscal year basis and the end of every fiscal year has to balance, you really have to be able to predict when certain expenses are going to happen. And the more complicated the exhibition, the harder that can be. I don't know if that answers the question.
No, I think that's helpful. Elizabeth, you were going to take over.
The only thing I was going to add is just that I work within the parent institution, so that can complicate things a little bit in terms of where your resources are coming from, the approval process. It's just a little bit different. And then it's really helpful to find out what things are going to be covered by your parent institution and what things are not, and just to be very clear about that, like insurance or marketing assistance, catering, those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. What would you say are some of the sort of special concerns when you're in a university art museum that does have a parent university in terms of this first stage of understanding how the budget works? Obviously, there are two institutions that you need to understand in a way in terms of budgeting.
Right. I mean, our museum is considered a department, so we have a departmental budget, and then within that we keep our own project budgets. Our own individual departments within the museums are so small that we don't actually have like a separate marketing department or a separate curatorial department budget. It's all kind of based on projects. We do need to balance out at the end of the academic calendar year, the academic fiscal year, and it can be a little bit tricky trying to explain why things are being pushed into the next fiscal year. Just because, a lot of the administration, they don't work on exhibition projects that go over several fiscal years. And so you need to clarify also what income is going to be coming in if you have, participation fees coming in later or other fees that you're expecting to be coming in later to kind of offset some heavy expenses that you incurred during 1 year. And then again, the insurance is a big issue. For us, our insurance, all of our insurance is covered by the parent institution. But that's not always the case with university museums. I asked a couple of different colleagues. Some do have it covered, some do not. They have to pay separately, or in some cases, if they're getting some particularly high-valued loans or exhibitions, then they'll take out an additional rider or policy during the time they have that exhibition only. Mm-hmm. That's a pretty important one to clarify.
Right.
The insurance is a really important issue. I would agree with that. And just the way that it works where I work, for most exhibitions, we find we have to ensure beyond our standing policy. And so since we do a lot of loan shows, international and domestic loan shows, we frequently apply for indemnity, and we really rely on the federal indemnity program to provide insurance coverage for high-value exhibitions.
Right, absolutely. I wonder if we can, there's a couple of questions that I want to circle back to, but maybe it would be helpful for us to go on to the next topic on the agenda and see how, if some of these questions kind of get answered in the course of looking at that question. The next topic was about basically literally how you start building the exhibition budget when you are at the earliest stages and you're starting to try to piece together the information that will lead to a budget. We talked about the importance of having a template of costs, and we circulated a couple of just sort of sample templates ahead of time, but we wanted to sort of talk about these in a little bit more detail, how you start to flesh out this budget in the earliest stages, and particularly thinking about in a very comprehensive way about the categories that need to be considered. So we have a sort of very general list, but we wanted to talk about this in a little bit more fine-grained detail. And if Kathy or Elizabeth want to take the lead on that.
Yeah, and we're just going to kind of walk through these categories. We're going to get a little nitty-gritty with the first 4 or 5, and then we'll go a little bit faster. So don't get too concerned if it takes us a little while to go through the first ones. But these categories on this slide don't necessarily correspond to the categories in the sample templates, but hopefully they'll all be helpful. And when we go through these categories and some of the items within the categories, you know, it'll jog your memory or make you think of some additional costs that you might not have thought of before, or that might be new to you because you're doing some, I don't know, different kinds of work or different kinds of exhibitions. So the first category is curatorial, and these are costs that you as the curator or your assistants or any kind of consultant curators are going to incur, and for the most part this means a lot of research and development. So we're talking about travel. You might be visiting galleries or lenders or museums, archives, as well as you know, entertainment associated with that. Anything that you need to do that's going to cost in order to build the foundation and the scholarship necessary for your exhibition. Don't forget, if you're doing an exhibition that's, you know, locally based or from local collectors, that mileage also can count too and kind of add up. It means research materials, if there are any books that you need to purchase, articles you need to purchase. And one thing I found myself actually doing yesterday was a lot of Xeroxing because I needed a bit of a mindless exercise. I kind of forgot about that. Any postage for bringing in some supplies. And then also if you have curatorial consultants or independent curators, those people are going to have their own fees. They're also going to have their own research and development costs. So you need to factor in their travel. Oftentimes this should be stipulated within the contract that you have with these consultants, and it's important to clarify, you know, when those fees are going to be coming in and how and when they're going to bill you for their research and development costs. This in itself is a great topic for another webinar dealing with independent consultants and curators. But it's really important to clarify that schedule, especially because you don't want to be stuck with a bill that you weren't expecting at a certain time. In terms of administrative costs, we're thinking about anything that non-curatorial staff might incur in order to help with the exhibition development. It could be costs for loan requests or condition reports. It could be costs related to the education, building the educational materials. It could be phone bills, conference call facilitation, like what we're doing right now. It can be staff travel also that's not related to curatorial work. I know we've had to pay for preparators to go up and meet with some artists, or for a particularly difficult installation, we've paid for preparators to go take a look at some work. Kathy, you want to mention that incident or where you had the preparators go out for a Chinese artifact?
Well, yeah, sure. So last year we did an exhibition. Hang on a second. I've just lost the screen. Last year we did an exhibition of ancient Chinese archaeological material, and we borrowed a 5th century tomb from northern China that was a stone sarcophagus in the shape of a house. And it came to us in 114 pieces that had to be put together in our galleries. And so it had been excavated just a few years earlier, and the museum that owned it had not put it together since it had been taken out of the ground. And they were very nervous about how it fit together, and we were very nervous about how it was going to fit together and what kind of internal structure we were going to have to build to support it, and so that the weight wasn't actually resting on the stone itself. So we sent our chief preparator to the museum in China to do a test run and to run through the installation of the sarcophagus. And it was money incredibly well spent, because when he came back, he knew exactly what we needed to do, and we needed to do a lot to get ready to install it. So that was something that when we first started on that project hadn't really been on our radar, but once we realized that we had this very complicated object, we talked about it and decided that was really money that we needed to commit to.
Yeah. Some other situations where your staff might travel could be for fundraising as well. Your development officer might need to go out to meet some additional potential funders, or might need some additional supplies, or you might have some consultants involved in that too. The next category is installation, and of course this is one of the categories that everyone I think kind of thinks of when you're building your exhibition budget, because it's the physical components of the exhibition. But within this group we put in design, and by that we mean the design of the installation itself, of the exhibition itself, not necessarily graphic design. This is someone who can design the layout with you, particularly if you have a complicated space and you might have some structures that need to be built, or issues with egress or ADA. Kathy, we actually haven't ever used a contract exhibition designer or had somebody in for that. Is that something you use often, or?
We've actually, right now we have an exhibition designer on staff, but that's actually a new position. And in the past, we've actually contracted for exhibition design. So it's been per project cost. So I think for that.
Yeah, I think here in Dallas, even though we have in-house exhibition design on staff, we also do contract out for graphic design as well, depending on the scale of the project and how busy the calendar is. So I think that, again, that's something that is always a question to ask, even if you do have in-house design support. Is the calendar such that that contract help might be needed? So it's definitely a good category to consider.
Okay, with that, it's the fees, the travel fees, the designer's fees, the travel costs, and any design materials, I'm assuming, or supplies, like maquettes or drawing up floor plans. So also within this category would be construction costs. Again, this could get pretty high. It could be any kind of supplies, like or materials like drywall or paint or nails or floor covering, and then the actual labor to prepare your space and get it ready. Also within here, we're considering the design and creation of exhibition furniture, pedestals, cases, mount making. Again, it's the design and fabrication cost for that. I know in my case, the mount making tends to get a little bit more complicated than I anticipate, and oftentimes that can be due to the fact that we don't actually have the information we need on these objects in order to give us enough time to really plan well. So that's a cost that can kind of increase on my end. Any special equipment that might need to be purchased or rented, like scaffolding, lifts, entry, and then the labor associated with that. Heather, I noticed you had electrical costs in the template that you provided kind of separated out. Is there a reason why it's separate, or?
I think that was separate, in the case of where you had to hire a contract electrician, not only the contract labor for an electrician, but also for if the permit needs to get pulled or actual kind of physical labor needs to be done to pull new electricity. This is more often in the case of like a video installation where there's really complicated electrical needs. That's not simply just the basic things that get done in-house, but really, bringing in new outlets and new power supplies. So that is, again, just one category that probably doesn't apply to most exhibitions, but it's just something on that template that is worth considering.
We put in fabrication of graphic materials, or didactic materials such as text panels. Some of these can get, of course, very complicated with image needs or potentially interactive needs. Your labels, titles, any banners, anything that has to be produced graphically that has a graphic element to it. Related to what Heather was talking about, the need for any new media, any new electronic or digital equipment. I've been doing a lot with some new media artists, and we got a grant for an exhibition I just did this past spring, and we were able to purchase some new high-def projectors and TV screens, which always means you also have to get speakers, and you have to get wiring, and so it gets a little bit complicated pretty quick. But you also might need some new AV equipment for didactics within the gallery. You have some interactive websites, and you want some computers in there, or you have some movies you want to show, digital storytelling, digital maps, any of those kind of things.
One of our participants here sort of commented how expensive this can get, and I think that might also be a question, is how much of that is being carried on your exhibition budget versus potentially another budget line. I don't know if either of you, is this something where those expenses are always borne on the exhibition budget, or is it a case-by-case basis, whether new equipment might be part of perhaps an institutional pool that would be paid for out of an IT line or an educational equipment line, for instance?
Well, my experience with that.
What about you, Kathy?
Sorry, Kathy, why don't you go ahead?
I was going to say my experience with that is when we need AV equipment for our installations, I always go to our IT department first and ask to see whether or not there's equipment that we can reuse or adapt. And because technology changes so quickly and because the requirements of every project are so different, my experience has been that it's been difficult to rely on the in-house resources. And so when I'm building a budget, if there's going to be even something as simple as like a video projection on a wall, I go ahead and I just assume we're going to be buying some video camera or projector. And then if we find out that we can reuse one, then that money can relieve another part of the budget. But it kind of prevents surprises. Because a lot of people around here, when we talk about those kinds of projects, say, oh, I'm sure we have something we can use, that's not going to cost anything. And my experience is that that's not the more proactive way to think about it.
And oftentimes artists will specify what kind of equipment they want.
Yeah.
And you have to kind of work with that.
So assume nothing, in other words.
Right. And one thing, and Kathy brought this up when we were just figuring out what to talk from the very beginning, is it's important to remember your deinstallation and demolition costs as well. We always think about what it takes to get this up. It's important to remember if things need to be torn down, if things can be recycled, if there are any materials that need to be destroyed or donated. That all is part of your budget. Another thing to mention is just photography in terms of installation shots. Some people have some in-house photographers and some people don't. Those photographs for your records and promotion, but I've actually had some situations where we were borrowing some work from an institution and they couldn't have a preparator come with them, so we had to photograph our assembly of the piece and send it up to them. And then also within this category, of course, is lighting. We typically think of the overheads and the spotlights, but of course you have to keep in mind special lighting for casework, any objects that might have light limits or control issues, and then, so in this case you're talking about possibly labor if it's contract labor or for supplies and materials. And then within exhibition contents or objects, just starting with working with living artists. If you're commissioning an artist, there's usually the fees that you pay the artist, the honorarium, the artist's travel, entertainment, housing, if that artist is coming to your institution, assistance. Sometimes you pay to bring one of their assistants with them to come work on the piece, or also you might be providing some assistance to help them, so you need to pay for that labor. One thing that tripped me up, actually, with this recent exhibition that I did, it was a contemporary art exhibition, and several of the artists actually they requested a fee, kind of like a rental fee, for artwork to show. And it was artwork that they had already made, and they were going to lend to me, and they were requesting a monthly fee. And I have to say, it was often the artists who are less established that were requesting a fee, which I can totally understand because, they need to make a living, and this is what they're trying out. But I did not anticipate that. I had expected loan fees from institutions, but not from the artists. So in this case, two of the fees were just exorbitant, and we couldn't tackle them. And then in the other two cases, I had to negotiate to bring those fees down. So I've just been asking some other contemporary art curators. This is kind of a new development. It was new to me with this project.
And I'll just say that that's actually one of the topics we've discussed for a future professional development webinar, is talking about working with living artists and this whole issue of fees, commissions, paying for materials versus other kinds of ways of compensating artists for their time and labor. So that's a topic that I think is very complicated and that we do hope to deal with in more detail in a future webinar.
Yeah, it'd be great to get some guidance on that, actually.
I think everyone feels that way.
Yeah. You might have some registration and preparation costs. We've brought in assistance for preparatory work. Kathy, have you brought in assistance for, or Heather, for registration work for projects?
We have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, contract registrars, contract preparators, contract conservators to help prepare condition reports during installation or deinstallation. So certainly those are all potential contract costs. Whether or not you have in-house departments, you might still run into contract labor costs there.
And I think going back to what Heather was saying before about the exhibition design and even graphic design departments in your museums, if you have them, you really need to check throughout the entire project to make sure that there is the institutional capacity in all of the departments to take on the work. Because we've also, from time to time, had to contract for all of these things, including registration, just because we have so many projects overlapping and we don't have the registration staff to necessarily deal with them all. So something to keep in mind.
One question I thought I'd throw in from the group was when you are working with contract labor, no matter what it might be, if you're the curator or the person responsible for budgeting the exhibition, are you responsible for getting multiple estimates from potential contract labor providers? Is that something where someone else in your institution provides that, or has that not been an issue for you in the past? I mean, the question was basically about, do you need to get 2 or more estimates from freelance designers, fabricators, conservators, and so on when you need to work with them?
Well, I'll start. Yeah, definitely. I've had to deal with that, and it depends to some extent on what the accounting standards are in your institution and what the procurement rules are. So that sometimes it depends on the level of the expenditure. If it's below a certain amount, maybe you can get away just with, 1 bid. But if it's above a certain amount, you need 2 or you need 3. It can be a real pain, and it's time consuming.
Have you found the same thing, Elizabeth, in your work?
Yeah, I don't think we do as much contract labor just because of the scale of our exhibitions is a little bit smaller. But usually our operations manager will be the one to go out and get some of the bids, and it is required, like Kathy's saying, for certain thresholds of cost. Yeah.
And one thing I was going to add in addition to exhibition contents, before we get to talking about the cost for objects, is of course the fee you might pay for a traveling show if you're not originating the show, in which case you still have a budget that you're developing even for a package or traveling show. And those fees could be a few $1,000s. It could be over $100,000 or $200,000 depending on the scale of the exhibition. One of the participants had asked, when you do have potentially very large fees and need to break those costs over several years, how does that, how have you worked that out in terms of accounting? If you want to sort of spread that cost over the entire span that an exhibition is sort of in development, Has that been an issue? Have you figured out ways to sort of make those costs more sustainable during over an exhibition budget?
Kathy, you might be able to talk about this. Our fees are never really that high. I mean, sometimes we will, ask the lender if we can split it between fiscal years. But I don't think we're talking about the same amount of money that you guys might incur.
Well, my experience here at the Clark is a little bit different from my previous experience because either fortunately or unfortunately, we organize virtually all of our own exhibitions. So we're never paying participation fees. I have had experience with that before, and sometimes you can negotiate that when you're negotiating the contract with the organizer of the exhibition, so that you can pay the participation fee over time. And I really recommend trying to upfront negotiate that, so that if you're paying $200,000 or whatever it might be as a participation fee, it's not hitting all of, at the beginning of the project.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like just from the question that potentially that might be something you need to negotiate or verify in-house as well. That you might need to talk to your colleagues in accounting to verify how that would work and get guidance at the outset of a project if indeed you need to break those fees across multiple years. Okay, I feel like I kind of interjected that question. I think that, Elizabeth, you were talking about the costs for objects once we've gotten past talking about artist fees and so on.
Yeah, actually this works perfectly because the next thing I was going to bring up was loan fees, which are the fees that are charged usually by institutions or collectors to borrow the work. Obviously, it's very important to clarify the length of time that fee is going to cover and make sure there's no surprises or no add-ons for that fee. Again, you might have to negotiate that fee down, of course, or negotiate the payment and the timing of the payment of the fee. Conservation, matting and framing, again, these costs depend on if you have in-house departments or if you have to contract out for a lot of that because you don't have those departments or you don't have the availability. With conservation needs, it's labor as well as their supplies and materials. With matting and framing and glazing, sometimes the lending institution will do that within their own museum and then charge you for those costs, or sometimes I've had this happen where a private lender has specified that we use a certain framer to take care of this, or that we have certain types of glazing that gets done, and again, that can kind of up the charges that we would normally estimate for these costs. Let's see. And then there's packing and crating and shipping, and these are some big items within the budget. In terms of packing and crating, there's the design, the fabrication, the materials, and the cost of packing itself. And I think hopefully all of us have seen a beautifully designed crate in our careers, and they're practically works of art when they're done well, particularly for three-dimensional objects. And they're worth it, but they can be pretty expensive. Sometimes the lender will bill you for these services if they want to have it done themselves or they're done in-house if it's from a museum. In my case, we've borrowed some artworks from some individuals who are not, professional collectors, so they are unable to prepare the works for us. So we've either paid an art shipping company to do the packing for us, or we've actually sent our preparators up to do the packing, and then it's ready for the art shippers to pick up. And if that's the case, then you have to remember the back end too, that when you return these materials, that when you return the artwork, that someone's going to have to help this collector bring this stuff back into their house and put it back up on the wall or whatever is needed for the work.
Right, the dispersal costs, absolutely. And the other one that I would mention is, depending on the institution, is crate storage. If you don't have room in your facility, in your storage areas to keep the crates in a climate-controlled place, that might be a rental fee that you would incur. And again, that is going to probably depend on the timing of your project, but it's something to put onto that template to consider.
And I mean, not everything needs crates. I mean, some of the works, some of the exhibitions we work with, as long as the works are professionally wrapped and we're using an art shipper, then it's okay. But if this crate cost can be pretty substantial, along with the shipping. This is a huge cost in exhibitions and preparing your budget. There's the incoming and the outgoing They need to be aware of your incoming and your outgoing destination, because sometimes they're not the same, whether this is a traveling exhibition or you might have a collector who's in New York when you get the work and the collector's down in Florida when you return the work. And then, of course, there's international shipping, customs issues, and couriers. Kathy, I wondered if maybe you could talk a little bit more about that specifically.
Sure. I mean, the international shipping, of course, can be a really big number because you, in addition to just paying the air freight, you're paying all of these customs fees and assistance at the airport fees. International shipments, depending on the value of objects, often have couriers, which is an expense. One thing that I would just, I don't know, this might sound obvious, but I have just found in working with a lot of curators on building exhibitions over the years, it isn't obvious, and that is that the more destinations in the world you're borrowing from for your exhibition, the more it's going to cost. And so when you're thinking about your budget, and if you're given some kind of maximum budget that you need to work in, you really need to be realistic about where you can borrow from. You might think that the most important thing in your exhibition is in Sydney, Australia, but your total shipping budget is $75,000, and I can tell you it won't work because that one loan is going to be half of your shipping budget. So we've gotten to the point sometimes, and this is always the moment of supreme pain, where we have to reconcile the checklist costs against the budget, and it's actually much easier if you think about this proactively from the very beginning. And it's hard to do because you want to build your checklist based on the best objects that will make the points that you're making in your exhibition, regardless of where they are. But there are sometimes choices that you can make between two things that could perhaps make the same point or a very close point, one of them close at hand and one of them on the other side of the world. And you might want to start with the one that's close at hand. So we do a lot of exhibitions with international loans, and this is one of the areas I think that is the most painful for curators in terms of trying to get exhibition budgets aligned with the curatorial vision of a show.
Yeah, I would, have also working on international loan exhibitions, I would say that same experience of even if a loan doesn't seem geographically that dispersed, but it's just across a national border, the difference between borrowing from Germany and Switzerland, for instance, just adding one new country to the checklist can be a heavy financial burden, and those are. And also,
Heather, just mentioning Germany and Switzerland brings something else to my mind that I was going to mention. And that is that it's good to be aware of the fact that it is more expensive to borrow things from some countries than from other countries. Not that this should prevent you from seeking those loans, but it's good to be aware of. And for example, Swiss lenders will almost always require you to keep their insurance and pay their premium. And it can be impossible. It can be very difficult to convince them not to do that and to accept indemnity. And it's not quite as prevalent in Germany, but it's actually a problem that we have with German lenders as well. So when we have an exhibition that is, we know we're going to be borrowing from Swiss and German lenders, I always put in additional insurance knowing that there are going to be some lenders that will require that we pay their premiums. And they're usually pretty hefty premiums.
One of the questions that has I've been tracking is this question of how do you start to estimate things like loan fees, shipping costs, courier costs, et cetera, at an early stage when you are just building the budget and the checklist is fluid, it's in evolution. And I think that's something that we are going to be getting to, that idea of using historic figures and so on. But I'm wondering if there are any immediate thoughts you would have, while we're talking about these costs about particular objects, anything you want to add to that idea of, how to start, where those predictions come from. Obviously you're talking, insurance, shipping needs, and so on. Are there any other thoughts you have on that?
I have lots of thoughts on this.
tell you what,
Elizabeth, do you have
run through
anything
this
you'd
real
like
quick?
to
That's
add?
actually the whole next slide. Is Kathy's going to talk about how to start coming up with some figures. And I am keeping an eye on the time, so I'm just going to go through these last few things because they do come into the budget. They may come into the budget. We've lumped the graphic design of didactic materials into this educational interpretive category. It may be in a different category, as well as rights and reproductions, brochures, media costs, any kind of interactive materials are going to be probably put within this educational interpretive section. Brochures, educational materials like docents' kits, and then of course you have all your events, which can be pretty impressive within your budget. Opening night or lectures or seminars, family days, and all the costs associated with that. We talked a little bit about catalog earlier, so just in the interest of time, I'm not going to get into that too much. And also, we mentioned marketing, which PR marketing may or may not be coming out of this budget, and your fundraising may or may not be coming out of this budget. Security, Kathy, do you want to mention just briefly about this, the security?
Well, again, this can vary a lot from institution to institution, and you just need to know how it works and what part of security might be charged to your special exhibition budget. For example, at the Clark, we have our normal posts for security that are in the permanent collection galleries, and they're in the lobby and, a number of places. But all of the security officers who are posted in our special exhibition galleries get charged to that exhibition. And so I always have to take into account security costs and think about the scale of the exhibition and try to ballpark at the front end how many officers we're going to need. Because the more rooms you have in your exhibition, the more security officers you're going to need. It's pretty basic, but if you're looking for security within the exhibition budget, that can become a pretty big number. We actually have a contract security. We have Curator does all of our security, so they're not on staff.
And then lastly, and this is my favorite category, this is the miscellaneous contingency, which Heather brought up we should talk about in just a little bit. I actually don't ever put this in my budget, but I'm going to try to now. Heather, I think you said that you guys do about 10% on average?
Yeah, 10% is the default, and I think that, again, this might depend on an exhibition, how many unknowns there are, whether, it needs to be even larger. And I know that, Kathy, you mentioned that you had never you hadn't anticipated the need to send your preparators to China, to sort of research that installation, but you then, in the end, did need to incur that expense. And again, that's the kind of thing that might, lead one to, at an early stage, kind of create a larger contingency when you know the exhibition has a lot of unknowns, maybe a lot of media components or something that, might create expenses. Again, yeah, go ahead, Kathy.
I was going to say, I think that's a good point. I think that the more unknown the territory is that your exhibition is exploring, the more you need to build some contingency, a healthy contingency into the budget, because things will come up that you just can't anticipate, because if it's a type of project you haven't done before, you're not used to doing, things arise that can be very, surprising. And I'll just give one very quick example. Last summer, we commissioned an artist in New York to create a new work for an exhibition that we did. And I had built the budget. It was a very tight budget. We had an extremely unrealistically small budget for this. And I had the fees and, his assistants and the materials and all of that. What I didn't realize until after we'd been talking to him for a while is he didn't have his own studio. We had to rent a studio in Brooklyn for the creation of this art. And so that was suddenly, like $3,000 a month to rent a studio in Brooklyn that it never occurred to me that, of course, maybe it should have, but anyway, it was unexpected, and that was a big surprise.
I see that Larry had asked for, in our case, 10% of what? And in our case, it's just an extra, once the entire budget, you add up all the other categories, we just add on another 10%, and that's the contingency / miscellaneous, and is, where any of these unexpected things would have to come out of. And of course, if we don't use it, which we try very, very hard not to use it, that money would then become savings overall on the exhibition budget. And it's,
I noticed there's a comment from Sarah Hall saying that she's not allowed to budget contingency funds. Mm-hmm. And I think that if that is the case in your institution, there are strategies that you can use to build a contingency in without calling it a contingency. And I can talk a little bit more about this when we talk about ballparking shipping costs and everything. One thing that you can do is basically take the worst case scenario in every category, so that we're under a lot of pressure too. I'm always under a lot of pressure to make the budgets as lean as possible from the first moment. But I just know that in some places I really have to take that conservative view so that when unexpected things crop up, I have some wiggle room in the budget, because actually we don't build contingencies into our budget either. We have certain people in our finance office who will look at that and say, well, why do you need that money? Take it out. So rather than dealing with that up front in an exhibition, I find ways to just be conservative in the way that I'm building the budget so that I have maneuvering room later on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just kind of a contingency spread across all of the budget categories where you might run into those questions. And I think obviously when you're dealing with a project-based creation like you were discussing, the possibility of those unexpected things are much, much more likely to happen. We had a question about whether we're going to go back to the catalog, and I think we won't delve into catalog budgets, so I think, again, that would be another great topic to really get into accounting questions. I don't know that we have time in the context of this webinar, and of course for some people, in terms of Kathy said, the catalog is not part of your exhibition budget, and so we kind of put that in there as a list of categories to consider, but is not something that we're, I think, going to get into a lot of detail. I did want to go on to, first we have another poll, which we hope everyone can answer quickly about whether your institution has a template that you start with when you're developing your exhibition budget from scratch. It's a useful thing to know whether you have something that you're working with, you're trying to develop something, or each exhibition is sort of its own beast that you're developing the exhibition budget without the benefit of that basic template. I'm going to just let people continue to answer that, but move on to the next screen, which is a question that we've had a few people ask about: how do you ballpark that cost? When you're at that first stage, just looking at an early version of a checklist and starting to build that budget, how do you go about it? What is the best strategy for starting to build that budget?
Well, I really recommend that you find a way to get historic data from your own institution and from what similar projects have cost. And actually, I found this helpful in several ways. One is within categories, and so that for a 7,000 square foot exhibition, how much did security cost? And for a 5,000 square foot exhibition, how much did it cost? So that you just have a sort of a sense of trends within your own institution, because they should be pretty much steady over time. And then taken into account for inflation. And then in terms of the kind of most perhaps unpredictable costs, including creating and shipping, particularly for a large show with a lot of lenders. I'll show a slide in a few minutes where I can show you some of the ways that I go back over older exhibitions and I kind of analyze them every way I can to try to figure out if I can come up with a kind of a rule of thumb of how much it's going to cost to put an exhibition together of 100 things that are going to come from 50 lenders from 8 different countries, or whatever the scenario might be. And I've gotten pretty good at it over the years. I tend, again, to be conservative in the way that I approach those figures, so that it's kind of not the worst case scenario in terms of the budget, but it's there is room for surprises. And then the registrars have a lot of experience with shipping, obviously, and even if you have a preliminary checklist that is not necessarily a list that you were going to go out and ask for loans because you're not there yet, your registrars can send that to an agent like Masterpiece or Artex or whoever it might be and get preliminary estimates for crating and shipping. And you probably know this, but these agents, they do this all the time. It's a free service. You know, they want our business. And those preliminary budget figures can actually be really helpful. And in fact, if you get something like that so that you have, you know, this one painting round-trip shipping from Amsterdam is going to cost you $25,000, and then you sort of have a ballpark of knowing in the future what that kind of loan might cost. So I think that if you haven't tried that, it's something worth doing. And the finance office too. It depends on who in your institution sort of keeps the books on the exhibition budgets and who does a final analysis after the exhibition is over to see what you actually spent versus what you estimated that you spent. And if nobody is doing that in your institution, then I think that it would be worthwhile to figure out how that can happen, because it's incredibly helpful. And it's not something that people always do, because an exhibition is finished and you know how much you spent, but you don't necessarily know how it breaks down into each category unless you're already set up to track it in that way. So that's kind of, I'm sort of colliding all of these points all together, but I think it's really important to get final figures for exhibitions that have taken place in your institution so that you have real life, you know, to base some educated guesses on.
I had a question just to ask about, you know, when you said, you know, bringing your checklist to Masterpiece or Artex and asking them to provide you those figures of what it will cost to assemble that checklist. At what stage do you usually have that conversation? I mean, how far along do you wait until you're like, okay, we need to figure out what these costs are, versus thinking, okay, this is still in a stage of development? What's the timeline for you?
Well, in my case, it really depends on the project. In some ways, it depends on how big and complicated the project is. If it's a smaller exhibition where there's only a few loans, then I don't worry about it so much. But if it's a large exhibition, and if it's the kind of exhibition where you know that you really have very particular lenders and loans that you really need to make this exhibition work, then I do it as far in advance as possible. I mean, we're working now on an exhibition for the summer of 2015, which is not too far away now. But I've been working with the shipping estimates based on a sort of a dummy list, because we don't have the final checklist yet. But we can make fairly educated guesses about the places where these loans are going to come. So I think it just depends on the project. But I don't think it, you know, I think as early as you can, as early as you have a sense of what the project is going to be, particularly if it's going to be one that involves a lot of international loans. I would do it sooner rather than later.
It's getting late. I'm just going to click ahead to the historic figures that that both of you had sort of put together, some historic figures to share, which I think is really instructive.
So these are some figures that I put together for some of our recent exhibitions, and just one way of looking at this. And it's, you know, all of these kinds of averages are they're not perfect instruments, because every project is different. For lots of reasons, these things can change significantly from one project to another. But for me, what this does, and if you look at like the last two on this list, the two big international loan exhibitions, are big for us anyway, close to 100 objects in each exhibition, coming from many lenders in many countries, and I took just what I just took the final total figure for crating, shipping, couriers, or crating, packing, shipping, and couriers, and I just divided it by the number of objects that were in the show. And so for the Picasso Looks at Degas show, we ended up spending almost $7,000 per object for that show. And then for a very different show, the Pissarro show, it was a little bit less, but not that far off. So I'm now using, for my 2015 show I was talking about, I'm using the ballpark of $7,500 per loan for that show, just as a kind of preliminary. And then as I get better shipping estimates, as the checklist solidifies, then I can refine that. But I think that it's a conservative, safe way for me to approach that project, because the project is not so different from those two exhibitions.
And Elizabeth, you had shared some information about a recent exhibition, or I guess this year, just very recent exhibition at the University of Richmond Museums.
Yeah, so almost half was time-based media, but then the cost was the equipment that we had to purchase in order to bring it in. We did have this one commission. I looked at two other exhibitions just before the webinar, and really our costs are much lower. We even had a ceramic exhibition that was about $500 per object, and we had about 46 objects in the show. But we don't usually have international loans. I have some great preparators who can retrofit crates for us, but we just don't have the volume of exhibitions that I think some of the other museums have. So sometimes we might have some resources and a little bit more time, perhaps, in order to, use. We're not traveling a huge number of exhibitions all the time, so we might actually have some crates in storage that we can retrofit that kind of brings these costs down. Or we also try to use the shuttles as much as we can. I'm sure everybody does that with the fine art shippers as well.
Mm-hmm.
And we have only two preparators, but they love to travel. So they also, if we have some packing and crating issues from a lender, they're always happy to go up there and do that, which actually saves us some money as well.
And I think that one of the points that you could put into the the list here of let me go flip back here. Is, talking to your colleagues in other institutions, is it's great to, gathering the historical information from your own institution is incredibly instructive, whether you're talking to registrars, talking to the accounting and finance office to get those budgets of previous exhibitions. But again, I think that this kind of information that we're sharing now is really helpful, and I think that there are a lot of, experienced budgeters that have these kind of rules of thumb, kind of shortcuts that you can use, again, at an early stage to just kind of get a very rough ballpark. And I would love it, as a result of this webinar, if people had ideas that they would like to share. I think it would be great to hear more from people, whether in the chat or elsewhere, about those kinds of tips that you use to, kind of get an early sense during the process. Okay, now I'm clipping. I think we have. Oh, there's one more poll that we have, and I think that now we're just focusing on answering questions, and we'll let everyone answer this poll as we turn to answering some questions. Let me. Here's a question that just came in about these ballpark costs. Are you talking about? You're saying that your ballpark costs are not including the entire exhibition budget expenses. These amount per objects that the two of you calculated. You weren't looking at things like the costs for catalog, photography, marketing, anything like that. Can you just talk about your methodology, so to speak, of how you calculated that?
In my case, that's true, and the trading and shipping costs are, as we know, one of the largest aspects of an international exhibition's budget. So I focus a lot on that because it's something that really needs to be carefully managed. And I wanted to say one other thing about that too. With those per object costs for big shows that we do, it's one of the reasons why we almost always try to do shows with partners, because that way you're splitting those costs. So we're not paying for all of it out of our institution. We're actually sharing those costs with other other partners, and it makes a huge difference in terms of, the shows we can do.
Well, a couple of the questions that are sort of in the queue here really have to do, I think, in a way with how do you protect parts of the budget that are important to you as the curator, and I think this gets into the idea of the sort of advocacy of the curatorial role in the budgeting process, is that Anna particularly asked about if you are trying to protect interactives, for instance, that you have an idea for a really rich interactive and you see that that's something that's vulnerable to being cut. And Emily had asked about, when the budgeting cycle kind of goes through its process and they go back and cut all the exhibition budgets, and you need to sort of be there to negotiate and advocate. Do either of you want to talk about sort of that process? How do you preserve and protect the parts of your budget that you think really matter, whether it's a particular loan that might be costly, an interactive that could involve a lot of development? How do you advocate for the parts of your budget that you care about?
One thing, this is going to seem kind of passive-aggressive, but one thing I've been able to do is when I have specific grant money that goes towards certain costs like equipment purchasing or commissions, or we have some educational goals that have to be met because of grants, that can be a way to enhance your argument for keeping those estimates in place because there's been promises made to funders for expectations. That's not the best reason, but it does make it sound a little bit better than just, I want it.
I mean, this is a really, really hard question because we've all been there, and there are certain acts that can be taken in terms of an institutional request to cut your exhibition budget by 25% or 30% or some huge number that there's no way to achieve that without, incredible pain. And at a certain point, you lose the integrity of the exhibition. And so, I mean, we have gone through this here. I think nobody is immune to this. I think it's very important for if that happens, like if there's an economic downturn and everyone is scrambling and everyone has to cut, the curators have to be at the table when those conversations are taking place, and because you're the ones who understand what the impact will be on the exhibition if certain things are taken out of it. And the administrative, I would say the administrative easy answer for any cutting of budgets is find the most expensive things in the budget and eliminate them. But that may not actually be the best thing for the project. And so I think everyone has to, in those situations, it's very difficult, but everyone has to be willing to sit down at the table, talk through everything, not taking anything for granted, and, be willing to give up something because something's got to have to go. But just trying to keep this mindset away from, well, that is the most expensive loan, so that one definitely has to go. I mean, that might be the most important loan without which the entire show falls apart. So it's a gut-wrenching process, but I would just say make sure you're at the table when it's happening.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I think that's a lot of our motivation for doing this webinar and saying, the more you know about the process, the larger role you can take in that conversation. And just looking at the results of this last poll, you can see that more than 90% of our membership either would like to be a bit more or a lot more, 45%, a lot more involved in the budgeting process. And I'm sure that it's exactly those kinds of gut-wrenching conversations that motivate us to want to have that involvement. April had asked a question about the range of artist commissioning fees, low to high. Elizabeth, do you want to say something about that? About I think we said we hope to come back to this topic in a future webinar. But when you're talking with artists about fees and you're starting to ballpark that at an early stage, how do you plug in numbers when you're thinking about an artist's fee or a commission fee?
Well, just like any negotiation, you have your figure in mind and they have their figure in mind. I'll kind of poke around at it in the discussion and find out what kind of fee they expect. And then I'll be sure to ask them about all these additional things, although I never have thought about studio rental, actually, as an additional expense that would come up, but I will now. If they have to have an assistant, a specific assistant, all those things that could add into the cost. Sometimes when, if they have a that you cannot pay, but you show them how much it's going to cost you to do the commission, that can be a way of showing them how much you're investing in their commission to try to bring that down a bit. I mean, commissions can go sky high. We've done as low as a couple hundred to, really a couple thousand, but we don't really do large commissions necessarily. In the case of this one Swiss artist in this last exhibition, he wanted to charge a participation fee and a materials and construction fee, and I was able to negotiate to get rid of the participation fee and just do the materials fee, and then we had the international shipping. I mean, that was going to be pretty high, and he was very happy to have the work shown in the United States. So I think he kind of saw what we were putting up front to get this piece here and maybe made some adjustments in that fee to kind of contribute toward it.
And another question that Allison had asked is about partnering with other institutions on large-scale international shows. This, I think, is for you, Kathy, but the question of what should be involved in the contract and how you share costs. I don't know if we want to get into total nitty-gritty about the contract, but when you're talking about shared costs, what for you constitute the shared costs in these partnerships?
Well, we share, when we do a partnership with another museum on an exhibition, we try to share everything that goes into the stuff that does not travel from one place to another. So, for example, the curator's fees. The curator travels to research and find loans and ask for loans. All of those kinds of expenses should be shared costs. We often will talk about shared costs, crating, shipping, insurance, anything like that would be a shared cost for anything that goes to both of the venues or to all of the venues. And if there's something that goes to only one venue, then that becomes a local cost or that institution's cost. We put the catalog in the shared cost category because usually you share the same catalog even if you're doing them in several languages. Most of the other costs are smallish, but it's kind of nice. Well, I would say that if you're developing that kind of contract with another institution and you want to get an example of like just a laundry list of things to think about as shared costs, I'd be happy to share something like that. It may not be that every element is applicable to every exhibition, but just kind of like making a budget template. Kind of nice to start with a template about that. And then it's a negotiation with your partner of, how those costs are going to be split. But it's usually pretty straightforward because it's, if there's a painting that's going to both of your venues, any cost associated with getting that loan should be shared. Conservation, framing, whatever it might be.
And in your partnerships, does one of the museums usually act as the banker for the incoming and outgoing, the revenues and expenses? Right.
Well, what we try to do when we develop a contract with the partner is to split the work up so that the burden of organizing and traveling the show is fairly equally split between the two institutions. So one institution might do the catalog and the other institution does the registration, or it's different again for every project, but it's important to think those things out up front because you can find yourself co-organizing an exhibition with another institution and then somehow find yourself doing all of the work, and that doesn't feel very good.
Well, I'm running back through the questions in the chat box, and I think that we have addressed most of the questions, or perhaps all of the questions here. There's some interesting commentary that I think is worth reading, and I think that again, we also said that we could be available to answer additional questions after the fact, and I think Kathy just offered to sort of share some additional information about separating shared costs from local costs for people who want that information. If there are other questions, I mean, certainly this is I think we're just the final moments. If anyone has a last question, please go ahead and type it into the chat. And I think that, again, if people have ideas that they want to share with the membership about how they approach building an exhibition budget, I think that would be wonderful, because certainly Kathy and Elizabeth have tons of experience, but I know lots of people participating in this webinar also have a lot of experience they could share and ideas that hopefully are prompted by our conversation. So I hope that Sally would maybe help us if people have ideas they want to share. Oh, and I see that Sally's putting up the results of the surveys for anyone who missed seeing them, which was actually, I think, really interesting. And I'm thank you everyone for clicking on the buttons and answering our surveys. I can see that, yeah, lots of us feel like we would like to know more, would like to be more involved, and like to sort of gain more information about the budgeting process. So I'm glad that all of you were here to see that. Kathy and Elizabeth, thank you so much. I really appreciate all your effort you put into preparing this webinar, and thank you everyone for participating. And we'll have more to come as if there's other questions that people want to send, we'll be sure to respond. So thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Please stand by.